Now, last Sunday we began what, come to think of it, is probably a very short series of just two messages based on Matthew 14 as we look at Peter walking on water. Initially, it wasn't my intention to do two messages out of this passage, but there is so much content in it that I felt I needed to do so. So as I said, it's the account of Peter walking on water. Let's listen to it again, shall we? Thank you.
Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed.
Quick recap of what we looked at last Sunday. We know that trust lies at the heart of every healthy relationship, including the one that we have with God. We also know that when all is said and done, it's difficult to trust. Even God, or maybe especially God. Now, the passage that we've been studying and we'll look at this morning talks about trust. And as we looked at it last Sunday, we picked up some principles that we can apply to our lives. So let's see what those principles are, and the principles we find in these verses. How do we find out whether we can trust someone? If things are fine, if there are no worries, if there are no concerns, no needs, no challenges, or is it when we desperately need someone to be there for us? When is it that we learn that somebody is trustworthy? In the good times or the bad times? And we know the answer. It's in the bad times, it's in the storms of life. And storms are a great test of trust, which means that they are also one of the great tests in our relationship with God as well. When times are good, the God thing is great. But when the skies turn dark, when the wind picks up, when the waves build, and suddenly we are not so sure about this old God thing anymore. Why? Because somewhere along the line we have come to believe that because we are Christians, there should be no storms in our lives. But that is wrong. Nowhere in the Bible do we find it that if you are a Christian, you are guaranteed a storm-free life. And so out of this concept, there come a number of questions that we ask ourselves. Do we believe that God can be trusted in the storm? Or then, if we do we trust that God will answer at the right time? Because hopefully we would want him to answer right at the beginning of the storm, not at the end. Now, if you recall last Sunday, I mentioned that Jesus only appeared at 3 o'clock in the morning. which means that the disciples have been battling the storm for hours now. So when we are battling the storms of our lives, are we going to trust him even if he doesn't appear when we think he should appear? Will we trust him with his timing in this storm? That's what we looked at last Sunday. Let's continue as we look at the rest of the passage now. Again, looking at Matthew 14. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him, they screamed in terror, thinking he was a ghost. But Jesus spoke to them at once. It's all right, he said. I'm here. Don't be afraid. Here's the first point that we can take from this passage. Will we recognize him when he arrives in the storm? You see, what happened with the disciples? They didn't see him. They didn't recognize him. And here's why. It's not that he was disguised. He wasn't. It's not that he was too far from them for them to be able to recognize him. He wasn't. They didn't recognize him because they didn't think that he could actually do what he was doing. They couldn't believe that he was walking on the water in the middle of a storm, being above the storm, being the Lord of the storm. And because of that, when he came, they thought he was anything but who he was. They missed him, they missed his presence, and they missed his power. And isn't that what sometimes happens to us? We are going through the storm, we are asking God for help. God, talk to me. God, show me. God, please make it clear. And God responds. But because it's not the way that we want him to respond, we don't see him. We are not open to the fact that he might be giving us an answer which is not quite the answer that we want. And because we are looking at a situation through the funnel of our own lives, through our own experiences and through our expectations, we just don't see God at work. And that's what can happen in our lives. But let's say that we get past that. Let's say that we get past everything that we talked about so far as we looked at this passage. Let's say that we've come to that point where we can trust God in the middle of whatever the storm may be. And let's say that we've reached that spiritual point in our lives when we are able to wait for God even if he only shows himself up at 3 in the morning. Let's say that we trust him completely. What then? See, trusting him is only the beginning of the real adventure. Everything up until this point has been prep time for the big event, which is walking on water. Let's go back to the passage. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you by walking on water. All right, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he looked around at the high waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Instantly, Jesus reached out his hand and grabbed him. You don't have much faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? And when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. You really are the Son of God. There's some really important life principles in these few verses. Let's unpack them as we look at. So let's look at the fact that in these verses we have a boat, a storm, and Jesus. One man gets out of the boat, 11 stay. Why? Because they were afraid. It's as simple as that. They felt that the boat was a far better option than going across on the water to meet with Jesus. Their boat was their security. Even though staying in the boat meant that they were never going to go to where Jesus was, it was their security. So may I ask you this morning, what is your boat? Because we all have a boat. What is it that you're clinging to, staying in, refusing to leave? Because you think it is safer than walking on water to be where Jesus is. Because let me say something that you may well have heard many times and you know about it so well. It's the words that we know so well of a book. If you want to walk on water, you have to leave the boat. And can I miss again? If you want to walk on water, you have to get out of the boat. So, what is your boat? What is it that we think that is better than the water out there, safer than the storm, even with Jesus standing there waiting for us? What is it that gives us the most safety we feel, the most security, the most protection apart from God? Because that is our boat. And at times, if we're going to meet Jesus in the storm, we have to get out of the boat. Because until we are willing to leave it and go to where Jesus is, we'll never understand the depth of trust that it deserves. Here's a second thing to think about. Where was Jesus? And it's not a tricky question. On the water. The waves. In the middle of the storm. Out there where it was not safe. And the water is sometimes where Jesus is. Now, Jesus could have easily walked to the boat and climbed aboard. He didn't. He stayed where the disciples would have to step out in faith, in trust, and walk to him. So let's try to apply that to our lives today. And I think we can identify with what I'm about to say. Okay. How many times have you heard people saying, oh, I want to go to a place, I want to be part of a church, I want to be part of a group where the deep things of the faith are taught? One of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, that's great, but what is the meaning of the deep things? What do we actually mean by that? Is it gaining a lot of biblical information? Is it having lots of facts? Is it interesting perspectives? Or even knowing the original meaning of the words in Greek and Hebrew and so on? Or is it then kind of saying, well, I didn't really understand that, therefore it must be deep stuff? Actually, what may have happened is the pastor just didn't explain it properly. He did a lousy job of it. And that's why it was deep. It wasn't deep, it was just not properly explained. If we want to talk about deep stuff, spiritually deep stuff, we find it in these verses that we have just read this morning. See, there comes a time in our lives when all that we see ahead of us is God's. And there comes a time in our spiritual walk when we will have to be challenged, and we are challenged to step out of the security of our boat and trust God implicitly. We will look around us, there is a lot of water, there's a lot of wind, there are a lot of waves. And Jesus is saying, trust me. Live the life that I've called you to live. Do the things that I've asked you to do. Give the things that I've asked you to give, and it will be all right. Trust me. Walk out to me. And at that moment, everything is on the line. We look at him, we look at the waves. Jesus, the waves. And we have to decide. And that is depth in our spiritual walk. You see, spiritual depth isn't just getting out of the boat. It is going where Jesus is. It's following where he leads. It's trusting him with the final destination, even if we don't see it. It is not just getting out of the boat of our security, but it's entering the chaos of the storm that we may see. It's trusting him whatever the outcome may be. Because at times, that's where Jesus is, in the storm. Not at the beginning of the storm, not at the end of the storm, but right in the middle of it. And so, do you trust Jesus with your storm, no matter how violent it becomes, and no matter how much damage it causes? Do you trust Jesus with whatever the storm may be, even if it's not the type of chapter that you like to write for your life? Do you trust Jesus even if the storm is the last chapter of this life before the first chapter of eternity? Finding Jesus in the storm, holding to Jesus in the storm, trusting Jesus in the storm is the deepest level of a spiritual walk that we can experience. Well, let's keep going, because there's a little bit more. It's all about Peter and what we can learn from him. So from him we can say, we can have a right focus. Peter, I like Peter. Talk about a guy who would open his mouth simply to change feet. He consistently mucked it up. But I really like Peter. Apart from anyone else, not including Jesus, what other person do you know who has walked on water? Okay. And we say, yeah, but it was only for a few steps. But let's give him some credit. At least he did it. Not like the other 11 guys who decided to chicken out and stay in the boat. Peter is the only person who has walked on the water apart from Jesus. And looking at what he did right and what he did wrong holds yet another life lesson for us today. First, what did he do right? He fixed his eyes on Jesus. What does that mean? Not just his eyes, but his entire orientation, his perspective, his trust. He made it all about Jesus, not the storm. And because he did it, he was able to walk towards Jesus. And then there is what he did wrong. What was it? He took his eyes off Jesus and he put them back on the storm. And when he did, Jesus wasn't everything anymore. The storm was. And I certainly have been through that cycle so many times in my life. Have you? Great at the start, full of passion, full of commitment and trust, and yet Christ is leading and guiding, directing. And then I lose sight of Christ, and I begin to focus on what's around me, the challenges, the difficulties, the conflict, the questions, and so on. And instead of seeing Jesus ahead of me, I just see the world around me. And I think that's a challenge that we so often face as Christians, as followers of Christ. We can walk on water, or we can sink under the waves. We can live the type of spiritual life which is characterized by trust, or give in to all that we see around us. We can focus on who Jesus is, or focus on what's happening around us. And as I said, what separates the two is trust. Do you notice how Jesus challenged the disciples? It wasn't you bunch of faithless, gutless losers. And he said it was, what have I done to make you doubt me? Where did I lose you? Today, you saw me feed thousands of people with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. You've seen me heal the sick. You've seen me raise the dead. You know who I am. Why couldn't you simply walk out and meet me out there? And then he said what they would have wanted to say, but they wouldn't because they were too ashamed. He said, it's because you don't trust me. And then you can imagine with just about a sigh of discouragement, Jesus climbs into the boat. And when he did, instantly the storm went away. And at that moment, those disciples realized how much they had lost simply because they did not trust. This was God in the boat. It was God out there on the water, and they could have walked to him without a single care in this world. But they didn't. Look at the moment and the experience that they just wasted. We could have trusted. We could have experienced the power of God. What were we thinking to say no? Let me conclude. Greg Levoy is an author and a speaker who once wrote about the teachings of this passage in terms of his own life. In one of his books, he speaks about how the story has challenged him, and what he saw there, he did not see a reflection of the disciples' account in his own life. Here's a few lines of what he wrote. So we have sinful patterns of behavior that never get confronted and changed. Abilities and gifts that never get cultivated and deployed, until weeks become months, and months turn into years, and one day you're looking back on a life of deep, intimate, honest conversations that you've never had. Bold prayers that you never prayed. Exhilarating risks that you never took. Sacrificial gifts that you never offered. Lives that you never changed and touched. You end up sitting on a recliner with a shrunken soul and forgotten dreams. And you realize that there was a world of desperate need and a great God calling you to be part of something bigger than yourself. You see the person that you could have become, but you did not. You never followed your calling. You never got out of your boat. And he concludes, I don't want that to be my kind of life. And I don't think any of us would want either. And you wouldn't be here this morning if at least you're not interested somewhat in what God has got in mind for you and for your life. And make no mistake, in that pursuit, trust is going to be the solid foundation on which we build our lives. Trust when the storms come. Trust with God's timing, no matter what the storm may be. And trust to understand that God knows the situation so well. And then the trust to step out to meet him. But before we take those steps, we really need to ask ourselves a question. What's our boat? And what's holding us back? Because that will decide whether we take that step of faith and trust or not. So again, let me ask you this morning. What's your boat? What is holding you back from stepping out in absolute trust? And this challenge isn't just for us as individuals. It is for us as a church as well. And as we move into the future that God has planned for us, let's be aware that we will face challenges. There may well be difficult times ahead of us. I have absolutely no doubt that the evil one will do all that he can to hold us back as we continue to grow spiritually and in number. And one of the ways that we can react is for us to, it is so tempting. And it's one of the ways that Satan will certainly try to hold us back. It is so tempting to simply say, let's stay in the boat. Whatever the boat may be, past traditions and past history and comfortable habits, our own personal kingdoms or fear of change, whatever that boat may be. But as a church, if we're going to be where Jesus is, if we're going to meet him where he is, there may well be times when he's going to ask us to walk on water. To get out of the boat, whatever that boat may be. And it may well mean walking through challenging situations which will take us out of our comfort zones time and time again. But as a church, as we do so, and as we look at the plans that he has for us, let's remember his promise as well. Listen to the words of Jesus. And because of his promise, church, it's time to get out of the boat. Let's go up there.